Yes, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome back to a brand new edition of Social Confoes. I'm Shalik, together with my host Diego. Diego, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I am doing amazing, Shanluk. You are looking amazing as well.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I'm trying to get the green in. I even have some green little lights as well, and even the drink. I'm
Feels
also
like the
putting in.
vacation that you good.
Yeah, well, let's keep it at that. But no, definitely, I'm looking for the next couple of months to kind of officially make my office. So that's the main thing that's going on. How about yourself?
I am doing good. We have, before we go into the episode, also quick announcements. We are on YouTube at youtube.com/ at Confoes. That's CONFOES. So subscribe there to support the channel. We're also on Instagram at IG at Confoes. And most importantly, subscribe to our newsletter at confoes.substack.com. For those already subscribed, they have gotten in personal emails with episodes with guests we had on with some highlights. So the second newsletter has already gone out with a recap of the past 3 years. So we grouped some content together, creating some more curated content. Planning to do that, I think quarterly or either monthly to curate some content. So definitely subscribe to our newsletter at confoes.substack.com. That's CONFOES.substack.com. So with that
Past
being
three
said,
years, wow, yes. So
yeah,
there are some slight changes coming, and like you said before we get into the episode, it's good to see that you really kind of decide not only your own destination, but also the pace at which you go. And I think that also fits in a little bit with today's episode, right?
yeah, definitely. We kind of deliberated on what we were gonna discuss today after some quite interesting guests in this past month, and maybe just go back to basic, as you mentioned before. You are creating your own office, but we're talking about creating your own fill in the blank. And we started this 3 years ago by creating our own podcast, right? And it started as social conversation. We started with casual conversations and kind of shaped it as we went along. And today you shared with me a podcast. I think I was familiar with it because when I checked the website and the production studio, Gimlet, I have heard of them before. They were referenced before in the course I did as an
Okay.
example.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Okay.
And I think the podcast you shared was one of the first, and it's kind of a decade old podcast, 2015, if I'm not mistaken. So almost a decade. And we're talking about creating a podcast, creating evergreen content. And that just goes to show that, some content is still relevant even today, even though landscapes change, even though technology changed. And
Let's you want to put that into
yeah,
perspective?
Yeah, I want to
Or
bring this into
okay.
perspective
Okay.
because you shared also your blog post from last month, right? About the book you're creating your own online career. And there was a paragraph there. I'm not sure if this is a rewritten intro. You said something about that, but um, just going to read it shortly. Where was it? Yeah. With technology developing so rapidly, talking about different social media platforms and streaming services could be like talking about different popular search engines and type of music and video players in the 90s. So, if we're referencing contemporary platforms, contemporary subjects, how evergreen is it? How long lasting is it? So, in that context, can you
You want to know?
elaborate more?
You want
Yeah.
to give an example of how evergreen something can be? So I'm not even gonna go towards Ray Tomlinson and those kind of figures who in the 60s, 70s already knew what the internet was going to be like as it is now, which is amazing. But I think, I'm not sure if it was Bob Iger or somebody else or another Disney CEO, but just imagine that in the 90s, we're talking 30 years ago, in the 90s, Disney was already considering an online streaming platform where people could go on the internet and watch Disney movies through the internet.
Also known as Disney Plus nowadays.
Yes. So just put that into perspective that back in the 90s, 30 years ago, Disney already had the idea of on-demand entertainment brought to your home. It was already there. It was just that the infrastructure wasn't there yet. And with the improving infrastructure and learning from different things throughout those decades, they've now created a massively popular streaming platform. But the idea of a Disney Plus or a Disney streaming platform, and yeah, so that just shows you. And then to put it into perspective, you mentioned the podcast that I shared with you, which is about startup of actually Gimlet, I think, because I think it's one of the founders or the
Yeah,
founder that kind of shares his story on how he got started with a podcasting company. And you mentioned it was 2015. And I remember
2014 actually. Yeah, it's actually a decade. April 2014,
and I
and
remember, and that's already 6 years ago, interviewing Pat Flynn in the
at the
lobby of a
social
hotel
media.
at the social media marketing world in 2018 and asked him like, "Hey, are we too late to step into podcasting?" And he was like, "No, the space is just starting out." So from that perspective, you can compare podcasting now to the creation of radio like half a century ago, and how popular radio was already back then, but still trying to figure out like, okay, how am I interesting enough for the target audience or for the masses? How do you innovate these productions? How do you improve the quality of the productions? And we're talking about lighting and me having better lighting now, but imagine podcasts 10, 20 years from now playing into people's senses. So not just playing into,
It
uh,
actually
yeah,
already there is a subcategory that covers that because
yeah,
like the podcast as we know it. So if we break it down, um, just to nuance the radio shows from the 50s, 60s compared to today, I do want to preface a little difference there because that was a way to for mass media communication, where now it is a media to create and the accessibility for people to share their own stories, their own content is the barrier to entry is lower than ever. But coming back to the type of content we are able to create, tapping into people's senses. Coming back to the example of Gimlet, if you listen to the episode from startups, it's a different format than the usual interview style we're used to.
yeah,
And I have produced during the On Deck Fellowship, I produced that format as well
yeah. I
into a
remember that
story.
episode. Yeah, I
Yeah,
definitely remember episodes.
into
Yeah,
a story driven format with some added production, with some added ambiance. And the way he's doing it is basically like you're reading a book, telling a story, and then you get insert from actual scenes, just like you would have in a movie or a
yeah.
documentary. But just imagine the conversation within a scene, and
It's
it's
just
audio
putting your
only.
mic on.
Yeah, it's audio
It's
only,
yeah,
and it's like you're listening to an audiobook plus getting a narration from a story and getting the visual painting through words. So that's already a way of tapping into senses. And if you layer on to that some music, some haptics, because music can make you go places. If you ever watched a movie without the actual soundtrack, I think there was a trailer once from the Mission Impossible. movie, and I think they forgot or removed the soundtrack. It was a totally different experience than without a full soundtrack. So imagine removing the visual cues and only relying on audio cues. How different of an experience that can be, and that's possible now with podcasting. So yeah,
And
it's
then
a
you
way to
get from
create
the
your own
audio
experience.
podcast to the video podcast, where there all of a sudden the video becomes important as well because the mimicking, the gestures, the facial expressions of the guest and the host play part in it as well. And I think maybe in a couple of years, might be even there already. If you're like a frequent listener to podcasts, you actually get scented candles sent to your house to light to get into the mood of the episode to even further the experience. I'm talking way beyond what will be the
Yeah, if we're
norm,
taking
but
VR right now
yeah.
and putting on those overpriced Apple VR headset, you're getting that experience. It's totally different. But then
So
again, it I do already see people doing it because then you kind of get a blurred line between types of content. As you mentioned, if we add the video component back, it actually what will make it still different than if you go on YouTube now, these compilation channels, these motivational channels that kind of take snippets and tell their own story. It's basically the same format. It's just the origin of the
it's just it.
content is different.
And of course, it's mass but niche as well. As Greg mentions here, it goes towards certain niches because it allows you, like we have seen 20 different in like a small area, 20 different radio stations because different target audiences wanted different kind of radio. And then with podcasting, that's made possible on demand. And you mentioned the aspect of the post production of podcasts. I don't recall exactly why I was searching for it, but I was searching for something surrounding the Y2K bug, and I came across a podcast. I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's Headlong Surviving Y2K. And that
Right?
podcast blew my mind. Like, from a production standpoint, the musical and the inserts and everything, the storytelling, and I'm not sure if I've completely finished the podcast, all the episodes, but I was so damn impressed. It was like it made what we're doing feel so amateuristic. But that's shows you how far how long we can still go and how much we can still improve in this space.
Yeah,
And
because
even
imagine
though,
these
yeah,
productions have been done in the past decade already, but it's only getting easier. And add into the mix the all the overloaded AI platforms that are coming now to kind of script out at ambience. It's getting easier and easier. So my only not necessarily concern is with more access to these tools, lower entries to barrier lower barriers to entry. There's a lot more crap that's gonna
oh
be
yes,
out there.
of
So
course.
it will still be up to the creators to set themselves apart by really going into production if that's what they desire.
Or keep it simple and for different reasons. And I think it's funny because we've talked about the Lucky D show occasionally, and what makes that such a fun, it's basically not a podcast but just an online show. But what makes the show fun is that when you comment, all the comments come into screen, and it's basically kind of, sometimes you already can almost feel that certain viewers are specifically commenting to
To
get their
see their name on the
comments,
screen.
to get to see their name on the, not necessarily that I want to see their name on the screen, but definitely that they want their opinion to be heard. And the show allows that format, which makes it easier and also better because if you're going to listen to the radio or watch television and you're
Yeah,
going
you
to,
don't have. We
it's
need to send an SMS or call
you're not
in.
engaged unless you have the SMS option, or you go on X and the X's show up on screen. But actually, that's one of the thing that uh, I don't think it's a definite or an important factor overall, but it does help and it does add to the engagement, as you know you're being heard and we're not scrolling over. And
So
sometimes when we do, because those comments don't always fit the narrative or the direction that the conversation is going in the show, you get into a situation where they are like
mm,
offended or not, don't appreciate the fact that they didn't see their comments come in. So you have that side of the story as well. But I think in
so
general, the production value will always go up. And yes, the barriers to entry are lower, but you will, of course, see that it progresses as there's also a commercial market for it. The quality also goes up.
yeah, basically, a rising tide raises all boats. So
Yeah.
there may be a ton of crap, but the ton of crap will be better than compared
Yeah.
to the best. There's two directions I want to bring this conversation for today. The first one is referencing back to the book, creating your own, and we're talking about online career. So you've been battling, rewriting, thinking about the direction of the book
Hiring a new writing
for
coach. Not that my
for
previous, just because Brad, if you ever hear this, it's not that my previous writing coach wasn't good. It's just that I'm over the amount of sessions that I'm allowed to book in my contract. So I had to
yeah.
hire
No,
a
that's
new
perfectly fine. But
writing coach. Yeah.
every time it brings more clarity, and I see it in the writing as well, like uh,
Oh,
the, the
thanks.
first
That's good to
samples,
hear.
etc.
Yeah.
So when we come back to the latest iteration and you're looking back at creating your own online career and reflecting back on the quotation I did at the beginning about the comparison to the 90s, like what's the approach, what's your take or angle now when it comes to creating an online career?
So I think
Or
one.
no, not the online career per se, but
Yeah.
in the context of, creating something in the book that would last the test of time.
So I think one of my biggest revelations, and I'm not sure if we ever touched upon this already in social convos, but one of the major revelations that I was having was that I wanted to include too much information on showing that I'm knowledgeable,
About
which about social media and online marketing, which to the reader is not really that important. It's more onto helping them understand certain situations, and also, weirdly enough, something that I didn't want when I started writing the book, making it more about me. Because people do want to know how you got into a certain situation, how you responded to certain situations, which for them is more important because you lived through it, instead of telling how Mr. Beast did it, which you can find in multiple YouTube videos online already.
Mhm.
So and most people will never be able to relate to Mr. Beast or to the Sidemen or to Casey Neistat, because that's not their trajectory. So it's much more important to figure out like, hey, what
Yeah,
fits
you
within
have your
my.
own set of circumstances and
Yes.
environment that kind of
And
fit
I
into it.
think that was a big revelation for me, that hey, it was more like, okay, but how can I actually help the reader evolve? How can I actually provide value to the reader, instead of being yeah, a book about all these facts and things that are interesting but don't necessarily help the person that's reading the book. So I think that's one of the big revelations that came out when I had to scrap the 20,000 words that I had already written and said like, hey, I have to start all over. But I think
What's
also,
that like? Like having written 20,000 words and just,
well,
not
it really
necessarily discarded,
depends.
but,
It
scrapping
really
it and going
depends.
back to the drawing board.
If the book was gonna be 25K words, and I already felt like I had edited it and it was already sent to an editor, and then the editor had already started the editing process, so an external editor, not just a self-editing, but an actual external editor, I think I would be more bummed out.
Mm.
I would be more disappointed. Now, of course, it's difficult, but first of all, I've already found a way to repurpose those 20,000 words that they don't get lost. So I think that's already bringing me to peace. And then secondly, it's you realize that the direction you were going in, not necessarily that it was wrong, but that it was actually better. And like timing wise, it's never good. Um, One of the things that happened, which I was happy about, is for instance somebody like Wodemaya, who's one of the biggest YouTubers and creators from the African continent. If I would have written the book completely and published it and was like, hey, the book's out and look, I've published my book, I wouldn't be able to incorporate his story. Now I'm able to incorporate his story because we've met. We had a couple of discussions. He gave a presentation to a lot of Surinamese creators. He gave his side of the story and how it's important and the tips that he gave to us as well, which is really good to incorporate from my own perspective into the book.
And
And
also that his situation or basically it's closer to home where he comes from than comparing someone like Casey Neistat who's based in New York, someone like Mr.
yes,
Beast who's based in I'm not sure
yes.
where he's based in Texas, LA, uh, West Coast maybe, but it's a
Mr.
different
Beast, I think
environment.
Charlotte, yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
But yeah,
so
mm,
I think that that example, that relation, and having have met him personally, and him
okay,
being here, kind of adds more relatability, I would say,
okay.
to that.
Definitely. Speaking of relatability, I do want to jump in to this comment. Um, so here's the thing.
Can you read it? Yeah, let me
Can't
read.
you
Greg
just think?
asks,
Yeah, yeah.
can't you just dump your unstructured thoughts into ChatGPT and ask it to write 90% of the book? Are coaches even necessary?
So if you use AI a lot, you understand that you have to kind of basically coach your AI. So there are two ways to approach it. One of which, and I think we didn't discuss it thoroughly with Dennis Yu, but Dennis will be able to tell you how to make sure that an AI really becomes your assistant and you can get the AI to do a whole lot of things
Yeah,
for you
to do it in your voice, to do
in
it
your
in your
voice, in your
uh,
way. But here's the thing that ChatGPT can do. ChatGPT doesn't know your real life experiences. ChatGPT cannot tell you, like, hey, you forgot that you can put this story in, which is interesting as well. Unless you write 100,000 words, you throw it into ChatGPT, you give them all kinds of prompts to remember, and basically, ChatGPT knows you better than you know yourself, Google style. And then you tell ChatGPT, like, okay, take the best bits all for this and this and this audience. So in that sense, you could use it if your goal was to create the most efficient book based on the knowledge that the AI has. But first of all, it's not going to make it authentic. Secondly, it's not going to write in the style. And I think I like the fact that I will be able to write a book that cannot be copied by AI. If I write the book the way I'm writing the book now, there is no AI tool which will be able to replicate that kind of book. So that's the
maybe
reason
not
why.
today, but yeah, I
No,
get
I
what you
no,
say. No,
again,
I get what you
the
say. I
more
get
the
what you say.
more information you put into the AI, the better it will be able to create something that resembles who you are or
Yeah,
how you think.
it's just approximating
Yeah,
your, but it won't necessarily be that.
it won't be, and for me as well, I will be able to see the difference. And what you could do is say, like, hey, instead of hiring an editor, I can ask ChatGPT to do it for me. But here's the thing: the editor has 10 to 20 years of experience editing books. And yes, ChatGPT learns quicker, but I mean, it makes a lot of mistakes, like a lot of mistakes. So I'm not gonna trust an AI that has told me that a certain player was actually drafted in the NBA draft, which it was not, to help me with editing my book. I'm actually gonna use a proper editor who has
And also
actually
a
edited books.
researcher to
Yeah.
fact check things, right?
No, but no, not necessarily. I would rather use an editor that has edited books within my genre or at least similar to mine. So I think that's the uh more the better approach. And maybe I'm a little bit traditional in that sense. Of course you can do it, but I don't want the book to be this kind of, oh yeah, I build it and I use it in a funnel and I make money out of it. That's not the ammo I'm aiming for. I want truly to be something that I worked on and that's authentically mine. And that's also a realization that you get into when you actually start evaluating and you get coaches. And why are the coaches important? Um, an AI tool will kind of give you either the best practices or the common knowledge that's already out there. It's not a human being. And that's sometimes what we forget. You're able. I mean, I have conversations with ChatGPT on a daily basis, but they're very much surface level.
Yeah.
And
Good go.
and the final thing that I will say that people don't understand yet is that there's a community aspect to it as well. There's a community aspect sitting with 10 other writers that are going and struggling and going through the same thing. And it's not like ChatGPT. Yeah, you can actually program ChatGPT to act
To
like
emulate it, yeah.
to emulate it, but yeah, I think you know where I'm going with this.
Might still be hollow.
Yeah, it'd still be like, I think most people will think this. And I'm like, yeah, okay. So I can actually, it's fun to chat to ChatGPT for like, hey, from now on, if I tell you Fawaka, I want you to respond in Surinamese, and I want to tell you to tell me a little bit of a story on what happened in the world on this day. That's actually a prompt that I'm willing to include to have a little bit more fun, but it will not replace an actual human being.
So on that note, thanks for the question, Greg. On that note, you've re-evaluated, the contemporary platforms, the best practices, kind of stepping away from that and going more you, but also how do you translate this to the creator process 10 years from now? We have an example of Gimlet from a decade ago.
Yeah.
Now we're going a decade further. Like what one thing kind of after your review that you see like with all the technology, with all the developments, with all the platform, this is something that's very difficult to take away from the process or kind of it's still core to the creator process for creating anything basically.
I think the authenticity is like, hey, if your authentic self is AI based, sure, shit for the stars. It's fine. You can do that. I mean, there's a market for that as well. There's nothing wrong with that. But it also depends on who you are and what do you want. And I think that's important to take into consideration as well. I think we're already seeing how much easier it is to create content in general. I mean, Devin's taking notes in the comments, and I think Devin just did one of those open these threads to explain to people that you're not a designer if you design in Canva. Um, but tools like Canva have made it so much easier to create certain type of content. Not necessarily the content that a real proper designer would make, but it speeds up the process. Like I can imagine that it must be frustrating for somebody who studied Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere for years and years on, and now you just have CapCut, which basically does all the basic editing so effortlessly and smoothly that you're like, wait, it's easier for me now to edit something on my phone than what it was 20 years ago when I worked in television and I had to cut out commercials and stuff out of the programming. It's like, wait, what? How did we go here? I just had a conversation with my dad about um, him working for a multinational company in the late 80s where they wanted him to keep working for them. So they bought this big fax machine up to a couple of $1,000, equivalent to a couple of $1,000 now. So he would be able to send out faxes with information from here to the Middle East and Europe. And now just imagine that that's just a WhatsApp message or
Yeah,
just a message in general.
just a swipe
And
away.
and it's not even that long ago because when my wife and I were doing our long distance relationship, which was 16 years ago, there was no WhatsApp video call. We forget that. We had to do it through Skype. There was no Zoom. There was no WhatsApp video call. We had to do a video call through to Skype. And then when we would get into a big argument, the internet connection would disappear and it would disconnect
How very
right in
convenient.
the middle of a heated argument. So just to think how this situation has changed. When I studied, I had to find in the Netherlands they had these 1-800 and those kind of numbers that if you would just call from the Netherlands to here, it would be like 55 cents a minute, which could really add up. And then
Yeah.
if you use those numbers, you call those numbers first, and then it would be reduced to 18 cents or something. And then you would call your, I would be in a grocery store and call my mom, like, hey, how do I actually make this? Could you quickly go through the recipe with me? Like, that's just an app
A
message
voice note.
on any, it's a voice note on any platform, basically, whether it's on a social platform or a messaging app or whatever. It's just one simple voice note. And back in the day, that would cost you a couple of dollars or a couple of euros just to get that information. So in that sense, technology is moving really quickly and everything will get easier. But then again, there will also, like already been mentioned, there will be a lot of unnecessary information and waste lying around, which you can also collect if you want to collect it.
And clean it up and put it on a silver platter, which
Yeah.
is kind of the curation, I'd say, segment of social media has been kind of, I think this was something in the mid 2010s that it was kind of a semi hot topic. I'm not sure about it now, if it's still, as forward or as prevalent, but I do still believe that curation channels, curation um, platforms have a big role to fulfill, because again, there's a lot of crap out there, and filtering that out, so that in itself can become a niche. Curate and then add your own layer to it,
You
put
have
your
no
own
idea
spin to it.
how popular these creation channels are. Like, the reason why they're this popular is because the algorithms of the social media platforms love them because they're a certain topic niche focused Instagram or Facebook page or TikTok account or which specifically caters to a certain need where if people come in and start watching that kind of content or engaging with that kind of content, they all of a sudden start spamming
Yeah,
that
I
way.
think you've mentioned, you framed it correctly, or in a better way. The curation feeds the algorithm, helps the algorithm. And I think that's
Yes.
the reason why I don't notice them as a separate thing anymore, because it's baked in the algorithm,
It's
and
really it's
you,
just
you, you
for
just don't notice it anymore.
if you really want to try this, if you really want to experiment on yourself, um, pick a topic, any topic, go to your favorite social media platform, and just for a week, purposely search for that content and watch and engage with the best content that you find. You will notice instantly how your news feed on whatever social media platform
Yeah,
you're
not
on,
just that platform.
it
YouTube, Twitter,
completely
X. I mean, sorry.
changes around, and all of a sudden you get curated this new interest that you have. And I think we're good as consumers as long as we realize that we're being funneled. I think that's the most important thing, that we do have to realize that the algorithm tries to funnel you in to see content that you want to engage with and that you enjoy.
I don't think that's nearly as where it should be.
Oh
You're
no, definitely.
saying, yeah,
The
because
YouTube funnel is a
I,
crazy one.
you know
That's
how many times per week I catch myself doing that, because I do have some meta knowledge about it, and that self awareness, and you catching yourself every few weeks. That's why I delete my browser history, my YouTube history every month or so, just to clean the palette. But the moment you just click one thing on anything, within the next day, it's been kind of molded to your
so
interest again.
to bring it full around. I feel people should create their own, but I do feel that this should be brought in as common knowledge at the elementary school level.
Like what exactly? Create the,
The understanding of how funnels and algorithms work, and
yeah,
how you can kind of believe everything you want if you want to believe it, because there is enough information on the internet that will support your case.
yeah,
So I
the
think,
bias, right?
yeah.
The kind of,
So for instance, I won't see any Andrew Tate content on my channels. But there was a time when he was popular. He still is popular, but when he was peaking in his popularity, where I had to, well, for work, understand what he was about, and as soon as I watched one or two interviews that he was involved in,
your whole
my
feed.
feed would completely change, and it would take a couple of weeks to have that kind of that cluttered out, because I'm not his target audience. So that's kind of, and I'm using Andrew Tate as an example, but there's so many similar examples to that, that you start realizing like, oh wow, these creators work together because they do all these videos together.
No, definitely
And
fair. I have that
yeah,
on YouTube. When you see, I follow quite a few podcasts on YouTube, and you see an interesting interview on one channel, and then suddenly you see them on every other channel on different podcasts, and you also follow that podcast, but you hadn't seen that exact
specific
conversation before,
episode, yeah.
and then, yeah, goes
When
wild.
I enjoy these kind of things when there are serendipitous moments that come from it.
Yeah,
Then I don't
that
mind
that
this algorithm. So one of the best examples that I can give is that I've been following Stephen Bartlett for quite some time now, and he kind of really has a very successful podcast, which is the Diary of a CEO. Great podcast,
yeah,
great guest.
that
Yeah,
that
yeah.
guy has been in my feed the last few weeks
Yeah, no, but
because
yeah,
a few people I follow have been
have been
guests on
guests
his
on
pod,
his podcast.
and then it
Yes.
just spiraled out of control.
And he had a guest on. It was a woman talking about better understanding how things work in relationships in general between men and women. And I was like all of a sudden listening for half an hour, and I was really intrigued with the things she was saying. And it also made me understand my relationship with my own wife better. So I went over to my wife and was like, hey, you've got to listen to this podcast. And she was like, yeah, I actually listened to her, but her podcast. So and those are kind of the serendipitous moments that I feel like if it hits and it connects and it brings more positivity and it brings people together, it's a good thing in the algorithm. But then there are also things in the algorithm that really, really suck. And I feel that maybe it's because they're so big, but Meta is really having a hard time with those kind of things. Really, really having a hard time. And in some cases, even favoring people that abuse the system.
Mhm.
And that's something where I feel like it could be done better. And there should be more time invested in it. And that's why it's important at a young age to install critical thinking for youngsters and for teenagers to better understand that the information that they're seeing, they can cater it themselves and they can be sucked into a wormhole of certain things that could may or may not be true, but create a divide between their way of thinking and others.
So that brings me to the other thing I wanted to touch on, going back to the example of Gimlet that we had in the beginning. And we've mentioned some, Diary of a CEO, some prominent guests. And how should I frame this? The context I want to bring to this is contrasting to your example with Wodamaya, because that's a totally different environment and demographic. If we look at the majority of content that we consume, Diary of a CEO, I think he's based in New York. Casey Neistat, all of the examples we
No, I think
named.
isn't he a London? He's I think a Manchester or a London guy.
Oh yeah, Brit.
Steven is British. I think is British.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I'm thinking
yeah,
of another one, Chris Williamson, another Brit, but based in New York right now. You have Alex Bloomberg from Gimlet,
yeah,
based in New York.
yeah.
You have um, Tom Bilyeu, based in LA. Gary Vaynerchuk, based in New York.
Yeah.
If you stack all these people and cross pollinations of content that we're getting and recommend it, not sure what Tate is, I think, mostly in Miami. So
Who? Tate?
um,
No,
Andrew
Tate.
Tate,
No, he's
Valuetainment,
yeah.
Patrick David,
Okay,
Florida.
yeah. Okay,
So if
yeah.
you take that triangle,
Okay,
and I call this a triangle of content,
yeah.
basically cycling through these three major hubs,
Interesting.
and it's getting kind of very, I won't say not curated to a certain type of environment, because just listening to the episode on Gimlet, the first episode, you recommended listening to it. Where in the world, aside from New York, aside from California, and maybe Miami now, can you serendipitously meet a venture capitalist, come up with an idea to start a podcast, and pitch him for $1.5 million that he wants to start a podcast and have a product in 3 years?
I think we already had this discussion uh, with back in the day with one of our guests.
Yeah, we probably did, but now I'm
Yeah. No,
framing
but
it in the context of
I'm
content. Yeah,
of I'm forgetting what the exact word is, but basically having a chip on your shoulder as a starting entrepreneur or as a startup.
yeah, pedigree.
But yeah, yeah, right. If you
That's the
have a
word
certain
we.
pedigree already because of your previous experience, then you have an advantage because you're able to get the funding that others wouldn't be able to
Yeah,
get.
and I'm not necessarily talking about the funding, but
Okay.
just the sheer amount of content and the kind of environment. It's
Well,
very,
Hollywood was the same, right?
yeah,
So, but these are also big markets. So it's one, the market size. Secondly, it's just logistically. Like, why are all the big companies
yeah.
based in New York,
I think
London,
that's an important
or
note there.
Tokyo?
That
So
the logistics. Yeah,
so basically, and this is where I come in and where I believe we can make a difference in the current age. So the traditional economic model, and I'm paraphrasing here, and I'm a little bit maybe uh, commoditizing it more than it should be. But basically, you have the economic center and the periphery. The economic center being like, if you purely look from an economics perspective, it's New York, London, Tokyo.
yeah,
And then you can make arguments that that was the traditional old model, and there are now other hubs that have become more important. Singapore is more important. The Middle East is more important than it used to be. So they are taking over parts of Europe and the US that would usually be in the driver's seat, but like the Middle East is a real hub. Dubai is a real hub. You have to accept the fact that they have been able to take part of the infrastructure and kind of lure people away to make them excited. And same to that from a content perspective and creating these productions, it's the same with Miami and Los Angeles and New York. Yes, they're the hubs, and what you get is that a lot of people, they want to get into those inner circles, so they decide like, hey, I have to move there and able to succeed.
yeah,
But it's actually harder to succeed there than it would be if you would stay in your hometown with a proper internet connection. And I think people are slowly are going to be able to understand it. And yes, it's not always the case because you can really be somewhere where the market is just not big enough. And but if you do it smart enough, if you understand the advantages and the disadvantages that you don't necessarily need to move there unless you're really aiming to become one of the biggest and you feel that that's the best way or the best approach. And the reason why I truly believe in this is something that Malcolm Gladwell mentioned in one of his books. I'm not sure. I think it's David versus Goliath that Malcolm Gladwell explains like, hey, listen, um, if you're in a top tier school or say you're an Ivy League university, um, maybe yes, the Ivy League university has 5 slots for that program, and your state, the colleges combined in your state have only 1 slot for the same program. It's still easier to be the one to get that 1 slot in your state than it would be to
yeah.
finish
Because
in the top five
the pond
of
is
a
bigger, right?
Harvard or any of those Ivy League universities, right? So that's the thing that you're gonna have to understand. So people automatically assume I have to be in the epicenter of where the content is
Yeah.
being created.
No,
But
in that sense, I like I have an example for a creator I follow that kind of is Australia-based, guy called Fusion,
yeah,
Hugo. He's
yeah,
based in Australia, Perth. Like the not even in the like the bustling central, it's all the way west side of the continent. And his content is very much based on the developments happening in the US technology. Every now and then he covers some Australia stuff, sprinkles it in to make it more relatable. But if you look at the views, the content, and I think most of the revenue comes from the US. But that just goes to show you need to build that
But you also
audience.
have to understand how it works. I love Dave Faarda, the Dave podcast.
Yeah, Dave is doing great.
Recently did a tour in the
The
Netherlands.
Netherlands, yeah.
He went to the Netherlands. He recorded, I think, close to 10 or a little bit more or a little bit less episodes, but I think at least 10 episodes. He pre-recorded and filmed them all to release them throughout the year. I mean, that's a big brain move because it will not only allow bigger guests because the market is bigger, but also the audience size almost doubles at least because he's able to get people that can relate with people that live in the Netherlands,
Yeah.
even though they have a Surinamese background. And of course, the revenue coming from YouTube is much more for people watching in
It's
the
actually something.
Netherlands than it is for people watching in Suriname, which is also something that Wodemaya explained to the creators here,
Mhm.
saying like, hey, listen, what I make from views and clicks in Ghana is peanuts
It's
to
yeah,
what we
it's
get in
nothing.
Brazil. And I think that's also what I'm really curious about is how the multilingual content gap is gonna close.
Hmm.
Because that's
Yeah,
something
because
that
Dave is expanding on the Dutch market now, like
exactly.
Netherlands.
Exactly. And so here's where I'm really interested and why I also think it's interesting when you're creating your own. If you look at the biggest languages in the world, how content on social media is being consumed and how much content is being produced. And when somebody like Mr. B says like, "Hey, listen, my fastest growing channel is Mr. Beast in Espanol." It already kind of tells you. It also tells you how many Spanish speaking Latin American guests have we had on social confoes. So you can imagine that all these artists like Web Bunny, I don't even know all their names, but these are all artists
Yeah,
that
I don't have the examples. I'm not from the.
yeah, no, but these are all artists that are really Carol G, for instance, huge. Like people don't understand. I think the most interesting revelation for me on how big Spanish is on YouTube right now is how popular Enrique Iglesias still is on YouTube.
Huh.
Like we know Julio Iglesias, we know Enrique Iglesias,
Yeah,
we know them. Where it's
we
part
know
of the
them as 90s,
culture because we're part of the
early
Latin American
2000s.
culture a
Yeah.
little bit as well. But you'll be surprised how much bigger Enrique Iglesias is compared to other artists that, from our mostly US based opinion and understanding, were much bigger than him back in those days,
Mhm.
where he's still relevant, where they are not. That's also because of the growth of the Spanish culture and the Spanish content. And that's just Spanish content. We haven't spoken about the role of Chinese, of Mandarin, and other dialects and other languages that are being spoken and are being used to be create content in. So I think that's an interesting dynamic where probably that's the only, for me, still riddle on how that's going to come together. And which
Yeah.
is actually interesting is that you might have noticed that social media channels are trying to remove that barrier. So, for instance, if you go on Facebook, basically they translate it for you. And when I'm in the US, I get extremely upset because based on my
It teaches you
location,
Spanish. Yeah.
no, based on my location, Facebook tries to translate Surinamese Dutch text to English and gives me the
Ah,
English version of the Surinamese text. And then I have to constantly click look original, just because they don't make sense.
but
So,
again, with the
yeah,
awareness, you can opt out of all these settings, but
yeah,
again, all
yeah,
these
but it
settings
was it
become
was
overwhelming
temporary.
over time,
Yeah.
right?
So I think, but main reason why I talk about it's because that's something that I noticed that they're working on to remove the barrier, because TikTok kind of really removed that barrier. Other platforms before TikTok
Mm.
kind of dove into it. I think Twitter was successful in that regard as well because it was interest
WeChat had
based.
this years ago, like
Yeah,
the
but
automatic
WeChat is still at the end of the day mainly uh, Asian
Asia.
based,
Yeah, but
right?
the covering the language
Yeah,
thing, they've already touched on that before. We are only seeing some implementations on the Western platforms.
yeah,
But yeah, with that being said, I think this was definitely interesting episode, kind of covering, creating your own content and touching on the different aspects of social media and how that evergreen content lives on. So you have something coming up, I think, next week in regards to creating your own.
yes. Creating your own business, which is in collaboration with UNASAT, um, and that's the University of Applied Sciences in Suriname. And I think what's interesting to mention is that the MOU that we signed is to work towards an associate's degree on social media marketing, but also that we work together to create courses that are beneficial for the audience that we want to serve. We both want to
So
serve.
creating our own education.
Yes, basically creating our own education, of course, within the guidelines of UNASAT, but we also made a distinction between CSR based training sessions and commercial training sessions. And I think that is something that I'm most proud of. There will be some surprises next week because we managed to find a way to get other partnerships in as well. So we're kind of creating a better curriculum as we go. But we decided we want to have an entry level event, which is the create your own business. And then from there on, build a full on course or use one of the full on courses that's already applicable or already there. Because UNASAT has an associate's degree in entrepreneurship. And one of the companies that we're currently talking about of partnering with, they have also multiple already completely build up courses for entrepreneurship as well. So in that sense, it fits in perfectly. And I'm excited with the amount of participants that we already have that signed up. But I'm also more excited to see what the spin-off of this event will be. Because a lot of people think like, or they consider it's my event or Ineffable event. No, Ineffable's event. No, it's really a collaboration between
Mhm.
Ineffable and UNASAT with other partners also joining in. But also more importantly, I only control a sixth or an eighth of the whole program. That's only my input. Everything else that will be discussed on that day will be done by other speakers and other experts in their fields. And they will talk about things that are about entrepreneurship that I don't have any knowledge of, or at least it's not part of my core knowledge whatsoever. So I'm also really excited once I'm done on that day that I can go into a chair and listen and kind of get all the information in for myself. So I think that's the best part.
Awesome. So if you haven't signed up yet, just search it on Facebook. You should
I
be able
think
to
it's
find it or Unasat.
ineffable.sr slash slash CYOB. I think that's it. That's really short.
Create your own business. CYOB.
Yeah.
Awesome.
CYOB. Yeah.
Ineffable.sr/CYOB.
Yeah.
With that being said, this was another awesome episode of Social Convos. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at convos.substack.com. With that being said, Jean-Luc, roll us out.
This was another fun episode of Social Confoes. We want to thank you either for listening or watching, and we will be back with a new episode. next week, same place, same time. Bye bye.